Hi everyone. In this deep dive video, we are going to take a look at the import option within the InStep Studio version 3 application. This will focus on items available in the expert interface. To see other options and other interfaces, please take a look at the other tutorial videos. The open button does pretty much what it says. It's the same as using the file import or the shortcut Control O. When we click it, we get a very default file import dialog. A few things to point out is that the different formats that we're going to see here are selected by picking a corresponding filter. And you can see that we have the common format, so the STL, OBJ, apply, etc. We also have FE, so finite element, computer-aided engineering, and so on formats. And then we also have all supported formats. So those are the three kind of catch-all type filters. And then below those are the specific filters for the file formats. If we leave it at the common formats and we're just going to import a very basic cube written in the OFF format, after just a couple of seconds we'll see the data loaded. What's interesting to point out is that when you then click open again, it will switch to the matching file format. So it will automatically consider that your next default to go from, but you can always switch back and use common formats to work with other files. The insert option is a slight change from the open in that if you have a file loaded, it doesn't first clear out the data that's already there. So if you wanted to add things to this, you could go to insert, pick your format, and then for example just pick a second file and it'll combine those two together. What's important to note is obviously that they might have different scales and so on. The next option here is very much on point to that, and that's the resize option. Now, resize applies to anything that's already been loaded. So in this case, if you wanted to only scale this, it's recommended that you first open that, resize it, save it, and then work in that workflow. So if we go back to File, we can also notice that there's now recent files being shown. So we have this most recent one and then the one before. We can click directly on those to re-import them, and that's useful if you go down the process and make changes and then you find out, no, that's actually not what I wanted, I want to start from scratch. You can just go in there and pick the most recent one. So in this case, if we wanted to resize that, we can just click on this button and it brings up the resize all option with work units, information about the current one, and then we present it with a number of options here, which is referred to as loaded data is in, and then we can say, okay, let's say we want to work in millimeters, but this was actually meant to be in meters, so you can pick the meter option. Now what you'll see is it'll change the scale, and that's really all it does. It says, okay, in this case the scale has to be 1000, so 1000 times bigger than what it was before. If our work units were in meters, for example, and we pick again the meter data, notice that nothing changes because it just says, okay, the imported data is originally defined in meters and we want to work in meters, so it's just a one-to-one, and that corresponds. What's important is that these scales can have an influence on tolerance settings and so on, so keep that in mind. Additionally, this work unit, and that's why there's a save option here, is applied to files that you export. So for example, if you were to export this into a step format and you wanted to use the step format in centimeters or in inches, that will translate, it will apply those scales to the exporter. What I recommend generally is to leave everything to be a one-to-one. So work in millimeters and, say it's loaded in millimeters. That way the application doesn't try to modify the values. It just says it's, the original data. If you start getting into this too much, you might see strange behavior in terms of tolerances and so on. If you do make a change, click the preview button. It'll show you what the effect is. If you're happy with it, just click apply. You can also access this directly from down here where the millimeter or your units are shown. So if you just left click on that, it'll bring up the same dialog box. What is to be noted is that when you import data, and we're just going to go ahead and use a different format here as an example. So in this case, you can see the data, it all looks fine, and you think, okay, this is great, we can just work with that. However, know one thing, that as you start zooming out, suddenly you start seeing these weird crosshairs, the Origin Triad, as it's called. And what that refers to is 1 unit of measurement. So the red, X, green, Y, blue, Z coordinates represent 1 unit. So this would be 1 millimeter this way, 1 millimeter that way. And if we were to change this to meters, then that would be 1 meter equivalent. But the data is very small, so we're looking at less than 1/10 of a millimeter, and that clearly indicates that something's wrong. And that's where the resize option comes in. So you go to resize and say, okay, I do want to work with millimeters because that's just a nice format. But let's assume that was actually loaded in meters. So that would explain the 1000 ratio. Click preview. And then you may have to zoom out and you'll see, oh, okay, now it actually kind of makes sense. So this whole thing is, 10, 20 millimeters across. In fact, you can get the exact box size here where it says X, Y, Z. So that's the width or the sides of the box that would enclose this. And the box in this case wouldn't be the minimal box, it would just be a box that's aligned with the X, Y, and Z. And it'll also give you lower corner and upper corner, so it'll give you the range of data that falls in. And this, for this example, that seems about appropriate. So we just go ahead and click apply, and that kind of makes that change permanent. So this would be more appropriate. Another thing to point out is that you can easily switch the display mode. So in this case, we're just seeing the faceted display. If you want to show the individual edges, the shortcut is Alt and E. You can turn that on. We can also show the vertices loaded with Alt and V. And this is where you may want to go into the settings, go to the application settings and make changes to colors and so on. So for line size, if this is a little bit too harsh on your screen, you could change this to a value of 1 maybe, and that'll update the screen to show more softer display, or 2 if you want to have a little bit the same goes with points. So the default is a value of 8. If you want to have really pronounced points, you can make this 15, and then you can see that the defaults generally work quite well, so it's recommended you keep those values. If you want to get more information on the overall size and shape, so on, without using the resize, you can just click the info, and it'll tell you the name that's been assigned to this body, together with a numerical value. The color, this is a ARGB style format in hexadecimal. The number of features, so this, you'll see that in the messages on the side, that will correspond. You also get a center of that together with its units, and then again a bounding box size. And this is more interesting if you have a lot of bodies and you want to kind of see how different sizes are available. If you do not have the information box on the side, you can go ahead and go down here, click messages, and turn that on. And the same goes for progress, status, tooltips, and so on. Tooltips is interesting. If you hover over something, give it a second, it'll give you a very brief information. What's also interesting about this, if you have a question or you need help with something, you can hover over it, and then hit the F1 button, it'll take you to the help page corresponding to that button, if there is one, otherwise just to the main help page. Clearing the data, it'll ask you if you really want to clear that and then generally you'll go ahead and click yes. In general, you do not need to clear data, that's just there as a convenience feature. Anytime you click open, it will clear the data again unless you click insert, in which case it will just append the currently loaded data. The InStep Studio application also works with non-polygon meshes. What I mean with that is the finite element style meshes. These will come from applications that generally do structural analysis or fluid dynamics and so on. The example here I'm going to show is just a log. So in this case, you'll see the statistics that there's actually 108 hexahedral elements. So these individual cubes represent solid volumes, not just surfaces on their sides, but actual volume. What's important to note is that the InStep application can work between those two formats. It's not an actual mesher, so it can't generate volumetric meshes on its own, but it can take surface meshes and generate a solid body from it, or it can take surfaces from a solid body and convert that to a finite element style mesh. And that's what's described here. So the ToFE converts any kind of polygon mesh, so for example from an STL file or so on, and it converts that internal data to a format that would be compatible with those applications. One point that I want to make here is that anytime you import FE style mesh, it'll add an extra tab up here called the Elements tab. The same applies if you do a conversion to FE, that tab will show up, and what that has is a number of extra tools that allows you to work with that. So if you haven't originally extracted the surfaces, you can do a surface extraction. You can also add shell elements. For anyone that's familiar with finite element models, you'll understand what that means. You can delete shell elements if they're there. This conversion of triangles to quadrilaterals and vice versa. We can smooth the mesh out a little bit, delete, and we can actually inflate it, so we can create a thickened surface within that style. Mesh format that is for example a hyperelastic style mesh, so it has mid-side nodes. You can delete those, or you can add them if you wanted to create such a mesh. And we'll cover this in more details in a separate video. Lastly, on the import side, if we have specific items we want to address other than display related, we can look for those in the application settings. And one item to point out is that when you import a file, it will generally recalculate the center, and it'll move the center point to the center of data. We can turn that off with the reset view on import. So if we turn this off, this actually requires a restart currently, but if we turn this off, then we can keep the view the same every time we load the body. So if you wanted to compare files and just by visual inspection, you could turn that off, load one file, take a look, load another file, and we'd see the same view.